Hey students, it's Dr. Hevert again, and we need to talk about primary sources and secondary sources because they are the lifeblood of the historical enterprise. It's how we historians both learn about the past and communicate what we've learned to our scholarly peers or to our public audiences or to our students. I want to start by making a very clear and direct statement. And that is, I have seen so many students over the years that I've been teaching think that going to a scholarly database and doing research and pulling out some articles for your paper or for your speech or presentation or whatever it is, a lot of students have thought that those scholarly articles are primary sources, or they get them confused with the sources that are most important to the project that they're working on. And because they're the most important ones, they must be the primary resources of the project. And folks, that's wrong. It's just factually incorrect. I don't want to be a jerk, but I don't know how else to say it. A primary source is something that is from whatever culture or place or time that we're studying. For a historian, and this is what matters the most, a primary source is something that is created, whether it's written, whether it's painted, drawn, recorded, said in a speech, any of that, during the time that you want to know about. So say you want to know about, I don't know, youth trends in the late 1990s. You're probably gonna find something about Pokemon, because Pokemon came out in the United States in about that time. And if you think Pokemon is big now, the only reason why it is now is because of the first wave of Pokemon hype in the late 1990s. So we could go to Pokemon Red or Pokemon Blue, and that would be a primary source because it's literally the game. So again, a primary source is anything that is created during the time that we want to know about. So I want to give you some concrete examples, and I'm really going to run the gamut here. I'm going to give you a ton of different stuff, and along the way, I want to tell you just a little bit about what historians do and how they do it and where they do it. And that's kind of the cool thing. All right, so let's go ahead and start. And we're going to start off with a banger. I don't know if you're ready for this, but let's look at a medieval manuscript. This is a manuscript that was created in 1320, the year 1320. And if you're wondering why it says 1362, that's the manuscript number so that the library can identify it. I assure you, this manuscript was made in 1320. How do I know for sure? I've held it in my hands. Not the digital copy. I've held this medieval manuscript in my own two hands. And where is it? Well, if you're looking up at the website, this is in the Vatican Library. Yes, the Vatican Library. How cool is that? Guess where you get to read this sort of thing? Not in that room, not in that room, this room. This is the manuscript reading room at the Vatican Library. One of them. There's several. It's kind of cool. I got to go there in 2015, spend a few days looking at this manuscript and others like it, because I was working on how medieval Europeans saw the world. And that's exactly what the image is. It's a world map, if you can believe it. It doesn't look a thing like the world that we know, but this is how medieval Europeans thought the world looked back in 1320. This is all they knew. Jerusalem's here at the center. You have Asia out here. You have Africa down here. Europe's out here too. I mean, they get Britain kind of right. Spain looks about right, but Africa looks weird, man. They got Italy pretty well. There's Italy. Here's the Black Sea and Greece. But man, the rest of it, like, Asia's weird, right? It doesn't look right at all. And where are the Americas? Well, they didn't know. This is a piece of primary source evidence that I can use to make a claim about what medieval Europeans knew about the world. Also, I want to draw your attention to the fact that it's round. Medieval Europeans never, and I mean never, thought that the world was flat. The Greeks had proved that it was round a long time before the Middle Ages came around. I promise you that's true. All right. So, one way historians can access these primary sources, kind of like I was telling you just a second ago, is through reading rooms in archives. Archives are where these primary sources live. And if you have the right credentials and the budget to travel to these faraway places, you too can go and read manuscripts all the way back from the very beginning of human writing all the way to the present. It's neat. You could end up in this room. This is the National Library at France. I haven't ever been here, but it's on my list. You could end up here, which that's the National Archives in Washington, D.C. Yes, we have those. And a lot of the primary sources that are related to the history of the United States are housed there. It doesn't have them all, but it has a lot of them. Every state has their own archive. Even UTEP has a reading room for manuscript material. They don't have something like this, but if you look really closely, you can see these boxes back here. All of those house primary sources. What primary sources are in there, I don't know. I would have to read the labels, and I can't from all the way back here. And you can see some kind of old printed books down on the cart over here too. This is on the 6th floor of the UTEP library. If and when you transfer over to UTEP, this is something that you can go and access. You can probably access it now. You just got to set up the right library card. So, just to round out the kinds of things that we could consider a primary source, we could look at a manuscript like this. We could look at the ruins left by the Anasazi folks at Mesa Verde in Cortez, Colorado. Now, not the picture. The picture of it is not the primary source, but if we were to go there and write about the buildings and take notes on the buildings, stuff like that, the buildings themselves are the primary source. It can tell us something. we could go to the National Gallery and look at this painting called The Last of the Buffalo, which was painted in 1888. It tells us a story. Now, we know that in 1888, Native Americans were not the only ones hunting buffalo. But what this does tell us is look how many of them are there. It's so many. And one of the stories of the late 19th century in the United States is that most of the buffalo go extinct. Not quite extinct, but they're hunted nearly to extinction. When you take History 1302, you'll see what I mean. Or we could look at something like this. This is the Rosetta Stone. And no, this isn't language learning software, at least the way that we understand it, but this is an artifact that tells an incredible story. And at first glance, you may not think that it's all that exciting, but look closer. If you look closer, you'll notice that there are 3 different kinds of writing on the Rosetta Stone. There's one up here, there's one in here, and there's one down here. Now, you may recognize this as Egyptian hieroglyphs, and you'd be right. Those are Egyptian hieroglyphs. This probably doesn't look familiar to you. Maybe you think, well, it kind of looks like Arabic, but not really. It's not Arabic. And then you look down here and you're like, what? I don't know what that is. But if you know your Greek alphabet, you'll start to see some things you might recognize. So here's a kappa, here's a delta, a tau, a sigma. This must be Greek. And it is Greek. This language is called Demotic. It's another ancient language that around the same sorts of areas, more towards the Africa side of things, if I'm remembering correctly. Here's the story that this tells. Until very recently, we did not know how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs. We didn't know. We had no clue. Like, we'd go to a pyramid and we'd see these very cool hieroglyphs and we'd be like, those are sweet, but I don't know what they say. But once the Rosetta Stone was discovered, that changed. And the reason why that changed is because we know how to read Greek. Greek's a language that's still alive. And people have been studying ancient Greek for as long as Greek has been around. We also know how to read Demotic. And what we discovered is that this Greek says the same thing that this Demotic says. And so start following the logic train here, right? Well, if this is the same thing as this, it stands to reason that this says the same thing too. And guess what, folks? It does. And through a lot of work and intensive effort, we learned how to read Egyptian hieroglyphs. It's a cool story. It's a way cool story. And we could use this as a primary source to illustrate that story, just like I did now. And if you're thinking, okay, great, Dr. Hevert, like, this is all old. Hold your horses. So much can be considered a primary source. If you wanted to study pop culture in the late 1990s and you didn't want to focus on Pokemon, you better know what this is. If you don't know, that's the album cover of Blink-182's third studio album, Enema of the State. Came out in 1999, and it is one of the most important pop punk records to have ever been put out. It has songs like What's My Age Again? It has songs like, oh gosh, All the Small Things. They're on this record. And it was a sensation. I owned it then on CD, as I own it now on iTunes. And it explains so much about the tastes of American young people in the 1990s. You may not know who the woman on the cover is. Her name is Janine, and it was a big deal that she was an adult film star and she was on an album cover. It got a lot of people talking. But we could use their music, their album art, etc., as a way to understand 1999. At least parts of 1999. We could do the same thing with Green Day's album, American Idiot. This came out in 2004, and it's a great record. Put out it got made into a Tony Award-winning musical. But put into context, it tells us quite a bit about the politics of 2004. 2004 was a rough year for the United States. Not only was it a presidential election year between George W. Bush, the incumbent president, and John Kerry, the Democratic challenger, it was also a year into the Iraq War, that same war that ended not too long ago. And this album, especially its title track, American Idiot, was a protest song, specifically protesting the Iraq War and President George W. Bush. And Fox News to some degree. It's in there if you read the lyrics. They don't say Fox News, but they mean Fox News. This is a primary source. We could also say that this is a primary source. Star Wars is an important film. And not just because it has grown into this incredible franchise that it permeates every aspect of American pop culture. It's seriously everywhere. It baffles me sometimes. I love Star Wars. Let me be very, very clear about that. But Star Wars came out in 1977, and it was a unique experience for film goers. If you were studying the history of film and you did not talk about the advances in special effects in Star Wars, you'd be missing out on a whole lot. So in a way, everything is a primary source for something. You just have to know where it comes from, and you gotta understand the people behind it and how it affects things. That's what history is, and that's why it's so exciting. You can do anything in history. It doesn't have to be the oldest, most boring things that you could possibly think of. Some people think that's fascinating and great. There are people I know who are interested in nothing but the flow of silver into China. And it makes their world go round. And I think that is the most boring thing I've ever heard in my life. And I heard it a lot at one point in my life. So boring. But if everything's the past and everything is a primary source, well then what's a secondary source? And how do we even know the difference? Well, it's a good thing, folks, that I am here to help you out. Secondary sources are more like the scholarly articles that I was talking about first. And that's exactly what a secondary source is. It is a scholarly piece of writing that analyzes primary sources. So primary sources are the past themselves. Secondary sources are people's arguments about the past that are built on primary sources, at least in history. So where Star Wars is a primary source for film in 1977, people who are writing about Star Wars in a scholarly sense, those are secondary sources. You can find secondary sources in scholarly journals. This is a medieval history journal called Speculum. Yeah, we have the worst name for our top journal. It's not great. Or books like this one. To really know if it's a tried and true secondary source, flip to the back, see if it has a bibliography. Let me switch to my doc cam. So if we flip in El Norte to the back, what we notice is it has extensive notes. You can see here. So it's citing primary sources. It's also citing secondary sources too. And if we go a little bit further, I guess they put it in front of the notes. What you can see, where did they put their bibliography? There it is. So if it's got notes and citations and it's got a bibliography, chances are it's a secondary source. It's not a tried and true method for identifying, but it's a good place to start. Even your textbook, in some way, is a secondary source. And the way that we ask you to use the textbook in our class, we're asking you to use it as a secondary source. So let's recap. A primary source is something that is created during the time that we're studying. If we're studying 1977 and film, Star Wars is a primary source. If we're studying the 14th century and how Europeans mapped the world, the manuscript I showed you, that's a primary source. A secondary source, again, is a scholarly piece of writing. I guess a podcast too, or a talk given by a scholar, a secondary source too. But most of the time it's writing, okay, a book or an essay that uses primary sources to make an argument about the past. So while a primary source can stand on its own, a secondary source uses primary sources to make an argument about the meaning of a person, an event, something like that. You're going to get a lot of practice in our history classes on telling the difference between a primary and secondary source. And we'll make sure that we label them along the way so that you know that you're on the right track. And maybe at the end of the course, you'll be inspired to go and look at some primary sources on a topic that you're interested in on your own. And maybe you'll fall in love with history just a little bit. See you next time.